Triplets keep following a millionaire to ask for help. What happened next will shock you. Drop your location in the comments before the story starts. Your support means the world to us. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty dirt road that cut through Jackson Miller's vast Nebraska farmlands. At 45, Jackson had everything money could buy: a sprawling ranch, profitable businesses, and respect throughout the county. Yet his weathered face rarely smiled these days, not since losing Sarah 5 years ago. Jackson adjusted his worn cowboy hat and checked his watch. The meeting with investors had run longer than expected, but it had gone well. Another successful deal to add to his fortune, a fortune that felt increasingly hollow with no one to share it with. His blue pickup truck rumbled down the familiar path toward home, kicking up clouds of golden dust in its wake. The radio played softly, some country tune about family and belonging that made Jackson reach over and switch it off. The silence that followed felt more comfortable, more familiar. As he rounded the bend near the eastern boundary of his property, something in the rearview mirror caught his attention. 3 small figures appeared on the road behind him, seemingly following his truck. At first, he thought his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. Who would be walking out here miles from the nearest neighbor? What in the world? He muttered, slowing the vehicle to a stop. Through the swirling dust, he watched as 3 identical little girls trudged determinedly forward. They couldn't have been more than 3 years old, with dirty blonde hair and matching worn dresses. Their small faces were smudged with dirt and their tiny shoes were caked with mud. Despite their evident exhaustion, they continued walking with purpose, following his truck's tracks. Jackson stepped out of his vehicle, bewildered. "Hey there," he called gently, crouching down to appear less intimidating. "Are you lost?" The 3 little girls stopped in unison, staring at him with wide, wary eyes. The one in the middle clutched a ragged cloth doll to her chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world. None of them spoke, but their gazes were penetrating, filled with a mixture of hope and fear that stirred something long dormant in Jackson's chest. "Where did you come from?" he asked, looking around for any sign of adults. The vast farmland stretched empty in all directions. No cars, no people, just endless fields of wheat shimmering in the late afternoon light. The girl with the doll took a tentative step forward. Her tiny hands trembled as she held out the tattered toy for his inspection. Jackson noticed something unusual, a small piece of paper carefully sewn to the doll's faded dress. "What's this?" he asked softly, gently taking the note without touching the doll itself. As he unfolded the paper, a childish scrawl revealed a desperate message. "Help. Mrs. Martha very sick. No food, no medicine. Old Thompson cabin." Jackson's heart sank. He knew exactly where the old Thompson cabin was. An abandoned structure at the edge of his property that he'd been meaning to tear down for years. Looking back at the 3 identical faces watching him with solemn expectation, Jackson made a decision that would change his life forever. "Come on," he said gently, opening the truck's door. "Let's go help Mrs. Martha." As he carefully helped the triplets into his truck, he couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had just happened, that these 3 tiny girls appearing from nowhere on his lonely road weren't just lost children, but messengers delivering him to a destiny he never imagined. The truck bounced along the overgrown path leading to the old Thompson cabin. Jackson glanced in the rearview mirror at the 3 identical faces staring silently back at him. Their eyes held a wisdom beyond their years, unsettling in children so young. "Almost there," he said softly, more to fill the silence than anything. The cabin appeared ahead, a dilapidated structure nearly swallowed by surrounding pines. Its wooden boards were weather-beaten, the small porch sagging dangerously. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the crooked chimney, the only sign of life. Jackson helped the girls down from the truck, noticing how they huddled together, moving as one unit. The one with the doll, he'd need to learn their names soon, pointed urgently toward the cabin door. As they approached, Jackson called out, "Hello? Anyone home?" When no answer came, he pushed the door open carefully. The scene inside struck him like a physical blow. The single room was spotlessly clean despite its obvious poverty. A few pieces of mismatched furniture surrounded a small wood stove, but it was the elderly woman on the threadbare cot that drew Jackson's attention. She lay semi-conscious, her thin chest rising and falling with labored breaths. "Mrs. Martha?" Jackson rushed to her side, noting her flushed face and the sheen of sweat on her brow. "I'm Jackson Miller. The girls found me." The woman's eyes fluttered, open, cloudy with fever. "The triplets," she whispered hoarsely. "Thank God they found help." One of the girls approached with a damp cloth, carefully placing it on Martha's forehead with practiced movements that no 3-year-old should know. "Sir," Martha rasped, "they're good girls. Abigail, Charlotte, and Grace." She pointed weakly at each in turn. "Been caring for them since my niece left them. Said it was temporary, months ago." A painful coughing fit interrupted her words. When it subsided, she continued, "No electricity, water from the creek. Food ran out Tuesday." Jackson looked around, noticing the empty cupboards, the carefully rationed candle stubs, the stack of neatly folded, much-mended children's clothes. "You need a hospital," he said firmly. "All of you need help." Martha weakly clutched his sleeve. "The girls, they can't be separated. Promise me. They protect each other." As if demonstrating her point, the triplets stood together at the foot of the cot, holding hands. Abigail in the middle, the natural leader, with the doll tucked securely under one arm. Charlotte pressed against her side, eyes wide with worry, and Grace observing everything with an analytical gaze that seemed to pierce right through Jackson. "I'll take care of this," Jackson promised, already reaching for his phone. "You all need medical attention and proper food. We'll sort out the rest later." As he arranged for an ambulance, Jackson watched the triplets gather their few belongings. The doll, a tattered book, and 3 tiny handmade bracelets, the sum total of their worldly possessions. They worked together with the silent efficiency of children who had learned early that adults couldn't always be counted on. Outside, the sunset painted the cabin in gold, making it look almost storybook-like instead of desperate. Jackson Miller, who hadn't felt anything deeper than irritation in 5 years, found himself overcome with a fierce protectiveness that surprised him. Sometimes help arrives in the most unexpected forms, he thought, watching the 3 identical little girls holding hands in the fading light. Sometimes those who need saving end up saving you instead. The antiseptic smell of the hospital corridor made Jackson wrinkle his nose as he paced outside Martha's room. The elderly woman was receiving treatment for severe pneumonia and dehydration, while the triplets had been whisked away for examinations and proper meals. A door opened and a woman in her mid-30s approached. Her sensible shoes and professional attire marked her as Rebecca Thompson, the social worker he'd spoken with earlier. "Mr. Miller," she said, extending her hand. "I appreciate you bringing them in. Many would have simply called authorities and washed their hands of the situation." Jackson shrugged uncomfortably. "How are they?" "Physically, they're undernourished but otherwise healthy. Emotionally." She hesitated. "That's more complicated." Rebecca led him to a small observation room. Through the one-way glass, he could see the 3 little girls huddled together on a single chair meant for one person, though there were 3 identical chairs available. Abigail sat in the middle, her arms protectively around her sisters. The doll remained clutched in her small hand. "We're facing a difficult situation," Rebecca explained. "There's a severe shortage of foster placements right now. We've called every home in 3 counties." Jackson frowned. "What does that mean for them?" Rebecca sighed. "We may have to separate them temporarily. There's a home that can take one, child immediately another." "No." The word escaped Jackson before he could think. "You can't separate them." As if hearing his words, Charlotte began to cry inside the room. Her sisters immediately closed ranks around her, whispering reassurances. "Mr. Miller, I understand your concern, but—" "I'll take them," Jackson interrupted, surprising himself as much as Rebecca. "Excuse me?" Temporarily, he clarified, wondering what had possessed him. Until you find a placement that can take all three. My ranch has plenty of room. Rebecca studied him carefully. That's unusual. You have no experience with children, correct? I have resources, Jackson countered. I can hire help. It would be better than separating them. Behind the glass, Grace, the quietest triplet, looked directly at the mirror as if she could see through it, her solemn eyes seeming to hold Jackson accountable for his words. Rebecca tapped her pen against her clipboard. We'd need to conduct a background check, home evaluation. Do it, Jackson said firmly. Today, if possible. Hours later, after a flurry of calls, expedited paperwork, and a detailed interview about his background and resources, Jackson found himself signing temporary guardianship papers. This is highly irregular, Rebecca warned, but given the circumstances and your resources, it's the best immediate option for the girls. As Jackson signed the final document, he called Walter, his longtime friend and ranch manager. Walter, I need the guest rooms prepared. We're having visitors. Business associates? Walter asked. No, Jackson replied, watching the triplets through the window as a nurse helped them into clean clothes. Children, 3 little girls. The silence on the other end spoke volumes. It's temporary, Jackson added, though something inside him questioned whether that was entirely true. As he ended the call, Jackson wondered what had possessed him. He'd spent 5 years building walls around himself, and in one afternoon 3 silent little girls had somehow walked right through them. In the observation room, Abigail whispered something to her sisters, and all 3 looked toward the mirror, again their identical faces reflecting a guarded hope that made Jackson's heart twist unexpectedly. The imposing Miller Ranch appeared on the horizon as Jackson's truck climbed the final hill of the long driveway. The main house, a stunning blend of wood, stone, and glass, stood proudly against the Nebraska sky, surrounded by manicured grounds that gave way to pastures and wheat fields stretching to the horizon. In the rearview mirror, Jackson watched the triplets' identical faces press against the window, their eyes wide with a mixture of wonder and apprehension. The 3-hour drive from the hospital had been conducted in near silence, the girls responding to his attempts at conversation with cautious nods or one-word answers. Here we are, Jackson announced as he parked near the front entrance. This is home. The word home hung awkwardly in the air. For 5 years, this magnificent property had been merely a place where Jackson slept and worked. Now, with 3 small children watching him expectantly, he realized how empty the word had become. Walter appeared at the grand entrance, his usual composed demeanor slightly ruffled. At 65, he'd been with the Miller family since before Jackson was born, transitioning from ranch hand to trusted manager and friend. His eyes widened at the sight of the 3 identical little girls climbing carefully from the truck. Welcome, Walter said, his voice gentle despite his obvious surprise. I've prepared rooms as requested. Jackson helped the girls down, noticing how they huddled together, forming a protective triangle with Abigail slightly in front, Charlotte partially hidden behind her sisters, and Grace taking in everything, with watchful eyes. This is Walter, Jackson explained. He helps me run the ranch. He's a friend. The girls regarded Walter with solemn suspicion. Abigail, still clutching her rag doll, gave a slight nod that seemed to speak for all 3. The grand foyer, with its soaring ceiling and impressive staircase, appeared to overwhelm the tiny visitors. They stayed clustered together near the door, as if preparing for a quick escape if necessary. Are you hungry? Jackson asked, desperately trying to remember what children needed. There's food in the kitchen. The mention of food brought the first real response, 3 quick nods and the slightest relaxation of tense shoulders. In the kitchen, Mrs. Hoffman, who came in twice weekly to clean and stock the refrigerator, had left a pot of beef stew warming on the stove. The rich aroma filled the kitchen, but the girls remained standing, unmoving by the doorway. Please sit, Jackson gestured to the chairs at the large table. After a moment's hesitation, the triplets clambered onto a single chair, refusing to separate. Jackson exchanged a glance with Walter, who shrugged slightly before serving 3 small bowls of stew. The girls ate carefully, with surprising manners for 3-year-olds. but Jackson noticed how each secretly slipped a piece of bread into their pockets when they thought no one was looking. After dinner, Walter led them upstairs to the guest wing, where he had prepared 3 adjacent rooms, each with a child-sized bed hastily purchased that afternoon and delivered by helicopter to the remote ranch. "This is your room, Abigail," Walter said, opening the first door to reveal a spacious bedroom with a window overlooking the pastures. "And Charlotte, you're next door. Grace, you'll be just across the hall." The reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. Grace grabbed Abigail's hand and all 3 backed away from the separate rooms. "No," Abigail said, the first clear word she'd spoken since arriving. "Together." Jackson knelt to their level. "Each of you has your own special room. Isn't that nice?" The horrified expressions told him it wasn't nice at all. Charlotte began to tremble, tears streaming down her face. "Together," Abigail repeated firmly, her small voice leaving no room for negotiation. "Please." That night, despite the 3 comfortable beds in 3 beautiful rooms, Jackson found the triplets asleep on the floor of Abigail's room, huddled close to the door, their few possessions packed neatly beside them as if ready for a swift departure. The scene struck him deeply. Standing in the doorway, watching the 3 tiny figures illuminated by moonlight streaming through the window, Jackson realized how unprepared he truly was. His ordered, solitary existence had been upended in a single day by 3 little girls, who clearly carried wounds he couldn't yet see. As he quietly placed a blanket over them, careful not to wake them, Grace's eyes fluttered open briefly. She regarded him with that penetrating gaze that seemed to evaluate his very soul, before closing her eyes again and nestling closer to her sisters. Jackson Miller, who built his fortune making confident decisions, stood uncertainly in the doorway, overwhelmed by the responsibility he'd so impulsively taken on. These weren't just children needing shelter. They were 3 little survivors with a history he didn't understand and needs he wasn't sure he could meet. Dawn broke over the Miller ranch, painting the sky in watercolor hues of pink and gold. Jackson, already on his 3rd cup of coffee, watched from the kitchen window as his unexpected house guests explored the backyard with cautious curiosity. Despite a week of his best efforts, the triplets still moved as one unit, rarely venturing more than arm's length from each other. Each morning he found them in the same position, sleeping on the floor near the door, their few possessions packed beside them, ready for a hasty departure. "They're survivors," said Elizabeth Jenkins, the retired kindergarten teacher Jackson had hired to help during the day. A gentle woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, she'd arrived with a bag of children's books and endless patience. What happened to make them so afraid? Jackson wondered aloud. Elizabeth shook her head. Children this young shouldn't know how to be so careful. They're hyper-vigilant, watching exits, rationing food, protecting each other. Classic signs of neglect. Outside, a small border collie puppy bounded across the lawn toward the girls. Jackson tensed, ready to intervene, but to his surprise, the triplets didn't retreat. The puppy, barely 3 months old, approached with wagging tail, and after a moment's hesitation, Charlotte extended a trembling hand. "That's Ranger," Elizabeth explained. "Walter brought him from town yesterday. Said every ranch needs a good dog." For the first time since their arrival, Jackson saw the girls smile, 3 identical expressions of wonder as the puppy licked Charlotte's fingers and rolled playfully at their feet. Over the following days, Ranger became their constant companion, sleeping at the foot of their makeshift floor bed and following them everywhere. With the puppy as an icebreaker, the triplets began to cautiously explore their surroundings. Jackson observed their distinct personalities emerging. Abigail, the natural protector, always staying between her sisters and any perceived threat. Charlotte, emotional and empathetic, the first to laugh or cry. And Grace, watchful and analytical, taking in everything with those penetrating eyes that seemed older than her years. Their quirks and traumas revealed themselves in heartbreaking ways. During meals, all 3 secreted food in their pockets despite Jackson's assurances that there would always be more. Sudden movements made them flinch. Bath time was an ordeal. They were terrified of the large tub, suggesting a history Jackson didn't want to imagine. One morning, he found them feeding Ranger, pieces of their hidden food stash under the kitchen table. "There's plenty of dog food for Ranger," Jackson explained gently, crouching down to their level. "You don't need to share yours." 3 identical faces regarded him with skepticism. "Promise?" Abigail asked, her voice small but determined. "I promise," Jackson replied, realizing it was the first time she'd directly questioned his word. A tiny step toward trust. That evening, when a business call ran late, Jackson returned to the main house to find Elizabeth reading a story while 3 attentive children, and 1 puppy, listened from a carefully constructed blanket nest on the living room floor. "They wouldn't go upstairs without you," Elizabeth explained quietly as he entered. "They wanted to wait." Something in Jackson's chest tightened at the sight of 3 pairs of identical eyes watching him, gauging his reaction. Not afraid exactly, but cautious, waiting to see if he'd be angry about the blanket fort, if he'd make them go upstairs to rooms they still feared. Instead, he settled on the floor beside them. "What's the story about?" Grace, who rarely spoke, surprised him by pointing to a picture of stars in the book. "Stars," she whispered, her voice so soft he almost missed it. That night, as he carefully tucked a blanket around 3 small forms still huddled on the floor, Jackson realized he was beginning to care about what happened to these children in a way that went beyond obligation. Dark clouds gathered over the Miller Ranch, bringing with them the distant rumble of thunder. Jackson, reviewing contracts in his office, glanced out the window as the first fat raindrops began to fall. A storm was coming, a big one, according to the weather report. His thoughts turned to the triplets. In the 2 weeks since their arrival, he'd noticed how they startled at unexpected noises. A storm of this magnitude might frighten them terribly. As if summoned by his concern, Elizabeth appeared at his door. "The girls are upset about the thunder," she said softly. "They're hiding under the dining room table and won't come out." Jackson found them huddled together beneath the massive oak table, Ranger pressed protectively against them. Charlotte was crying silently, face buried in Abigail's shoulder. Even the usually stoic Grace appeared terrified, her small body trembling. With each thunderclap, memories washed over Jackson of himself at age 5, hiding in his closet during storms while his father mocked his fear. His mother would sneak in later, bringing a flashlight and stories to distract him until the thunder passed. "Hey there," he said gently, crouching down to their level. "I used to be scared of storms too when I was your age." 3 identical pairs of eyes regarded him with surprise. "You were?" Charlotte whispered between sniffles. "Sure was," Jackson admitted. "Want to know what helped me?" The girls nodded cautiously. 20 minutes later, the formal living room had been transformed. Blankets stretched from sofa to chairs, creating a cozy tent illuminated by battery-powered lanterns. Inside, Jackson sat surrounded by the triplets and Ranger, a star map spread before them. "When I was scared, my mom told me stories about the stars," he explained, pointing to constellations on the map. "She said each one had a story, and if I learned them all, I'd never really be alone." A tremendous crack of thunder shook the windows. Charlotte gasped, instinctively reaching out, not to her sisters this time, but to Jackson. Her tiny hand clutched his, her eyes wide with fear but also with a new, fragile trust. Jackson held her hand gently, continuing his story about the stars until her breathing steadied. Something shifted in that moment, a small but profound change in their delicate relationship. The storm raged throughout the evening, but inside their makeshift fort, Jackson taught the girls to count the seconds between lightning and thunder, explaining how it told you how far away the storm was. By bedtime, they were counting together, Charlotte still occasionally clutching his hand when the thunder was particularly loud. For the first time since their arrival, the triplets didn't insist on sleeping on the floor by the door. Instead, they fell asleep inside the blanket fort, Ranger curled protectively at their feet. Jackson stayed nearby in an armchair, unwilling to break this newfound trust by leaving. Morning brought clear skies and another surprise. As Jackson prepared breakfast, Grace approached him silently, offering a folded piece of paper. Inside was a crayon drawing, 4 stick figures standing under what appeared to be a roof, with a small brown blob that might have been Ranger. "Is this us?" Jackson asked gently. Grace nodded, her expression serious as always, but something new flickered in her eyes. A tentative hope. Later that day, Martha arrived from the hospital, now recovered enough for a short visit. The elderly woman wept when she saw the girls, gathering them in a hug that they eagerly returned. "You've done well by them," she told Jackson privately. "They look better, less afraid." As Martha shared stories about the triplets' mother, her niece who had gone to find work and never returned, Jackson watched the girls playing with Ranger in the yard, their movements freer than before, their whispered conversations occasionally, punctuated by soft laughter. The blanket fort remained in his living room for many days afterward. A beginning, a connection, a tiny bridge across the vast chasm of trust that still lay between them. After a month at the Miller Ranch, the triplets had established small routines that signaled their growing comfort. They no longer slept huddled by the door, though they still insisted on sharing a room. Ranger had become their constant companion and protector, alerting Jackson with insistent barking if any of the girls became upset. One morning, Jackson realized the girls needed proper clothes and supplies. Their few possessions were worn thin, and they deserved more than the emergency basics he'd hastily purchased. "We're going to town today," he announced over breakfast, "to buy some new things for you." The news was met with apprehension. 3 identical faces looked up from their cereal bowls, expressions ranging from curiosity to outright fear. "Will we come back?" Abigail asked carefully, her hand automatically reaching for her sister's. The question struck Jackson like a physical blow. "Of course," he assured them. "This is your home now for as long as you need it." Their first trip to Willow Creek, the small town 30 miles from the ranch, began promisingly. The girls sat close together in the back seat, pointing at horses and cows in the passing fields. Jackson felt a spark of pride when Charlotte actually giggled at a family of rabbits crossing the road. The town's main street was quiet that Tuesday morning, with just a few locals going about their business. Still, heads turned as Jackson Miller, known locally as a wealthy recluse since his wife's death, escorted 3 identical little girls from his truck. Their first stop was Henderson's Clothing, where the elderly proprietor fussed over the triplets, helping them try on sturdy jeans, colorful shirts, and proper boots. Grace, usually stoic, couldn't hide her wonder at a pair of purple sneakers that lit up when she walked. It was at the small toy store next door that the problems began. As Jackson helped the girls select stuffed animals, companions for Abigail's tattered doll, a group of older children entered with their mother. "Look, it's the weird triplets," one boy about 8 years old whispered loudly, pointing. "My mom says they were abandoned because nobody wanted them. Why do they look exactly the same?" "It's creepy," added his sister, staring openly. Charlotte's eyes immediately filled with tears. Grace froze, her face expressionless but her body rigid with tension. Abigail stepped protectively in front of her sisters, small hands clenched into fists. "That's quite enough," Jackson said firmly, placing himself between the triplets and the other children. "Apologize, please." The mother, looking embarrassed, urged her children to apologize, but the damage was done. The magical day had shattered. The triplets retreated into silence, their brief moments of joy replaced by the wary guardedness of their first days at the ranch. On the drive home, Jackson watched them in the rearview mirror, 3 identical profiles staring out the window, their new stuffed animals clutched tightly but their expressions closed and distant. That night, putting away the last of their new clothes, Jackson overheard Abigail speaking softly to her sisters in their shared bedroom. "It doesn't matter what they say," she whispered fiercely. "We have each other. Nobody can take that away. Nobody will separate us. I promise." The determination in her young voice, a child making promises no child should need to make, broke something in Jackson's heart. He leaned against the hallway wall, overwhelmed by a sudden clarity. Providing shelter and food wasn't enough. These children needed more than safety. They needed belonging, acceptance, a true home. And he, a man who had walled himself off from emotional connections for 5 years, wasn't sure he knew how to give them that. But hearing Abigail's fierce promise to her sisters, Jackson made a silent promise of his own. He would try. For them, he would try. The morning after their difficult trip to town, Jackson stood at his office window, watching the triplets in the backyard. Unlike their usual huddled formation, they sat slightly apart today, each lost in her own thoughts. Even Ranger's playful attempts to engage them earned only half-hearted responses. Jackson's phone rang. Rebecca Thompson, checking on their progress. "They're physically healthy," he reported, "but emotionally. Yesterday was rough." After explaining the incident in town, Rebecca sighed. Children can be cruel without meaning to be. For kids like the triplets who already feel different, these encounters can reopen wounds. "What can I do?" Jackson asked, surprising himself with how much he cared about the answer. "Give them something that builds confidence and connection," Rebecca suggested. "Something that makes them feel capable and valued." After hanging up, Jackson watched the girls again, noticing how their eyes followed the ranch hands leading horses to the stable. An idea began to form. That afternoon, he led the triplets to the smaller corral where the gentlest horses were kept. Charlotte immediately clung to Abigail, while Grace observed everything with her usual analytical gaze. "This is Starlight," Jackson introduced, stroking the nose of a patient, dapple-gray mare. "She's special because she's excellent with beginners. Would you like to meet her?" Abigail, always the protector, stepped forward first. With Jackson's guidance, she offered her small palm to the horse, gasping softly when Starlight's velvety muzzle tickled her hand. "She likes you," Jackson said, noting the tiny smile that flickered across Abigail's face. "Who's next?" To his surprise, Grace approached, her movements deliberate and careful. The usually reserved child showed no fear as she mimicked her sister's actions perfectly. Charlotte hung back, eyes wide. "She's so big," she whispered. "But very gentle," Jackson assured her, crouching to Charlotte's level. "Sometimes the biggest things can be the gentlest. Want to try?" After several minutes of gentle coaxing, Charlotte finally extended a trembling hand. When Starlight delicately accepted the offered apple slice, the little girl's face transformed with wonder. Over the following days, Jackson established a routine. Each morning after breakfast, they'd visit the stables. He taught them to groom the horses with specially made child-sized brushes, to recognize different feeds, and to understand the animal's body language. "Horses are like people," he explained, one morning helping Grace measure oats. "They all have different personalities. Starlight is patient and kind. Thunder over there is spirited and playful." "Like us," Abigail observed unexpectedly. "I'm like Thunder. Charlotte is like Starlight." "And Grace?" Jackson asked. "Grace is like Shadow," Abigail decided, pointing to the observant black mare who watched everything from the corner stall. "She sees everything." It was the most personal observation any of the girls had shared, and Jackson treasured it like a gift. Charlotte, initially the most fearful, developed an unexpected bond with Starlight. The gentle mare seemed to sense her anxiety, standing perfectly still when Charlotte was near, lowering her head to make herself less intimidating. Jackson adapted his workshop, creating 3 sets of child-sized tools painted in different colors: blue for Abigail, purple for Grace, and pink for Charlotte. He taught them simple tasks: filling water troughs, measuring feed, even helping collect eggs from the chicken coop. "You're my official ranch hands now," he announced, presenting each with a miniature straw hat like the ones his adult workers wore. The pride that shone in their identical faces was something Jackson hadn't anticipated. These children, who had known so little stability, thrived when given responsibilities they could manage, tasks that made them feel needed and capable. One warm afternoon, after their chores were completed, Jackson packed a simple picnic and took them to the small creek that cut through his property. Under the shade of willow trees, he showed them how to make little boats from leaves and twigs. "My father taught me this when I was about your age," he explained, demonstrating how to secure a leaf to a twig with a blade of grass. We'd have races to see whose boat could travel the farthest. 3 pairs of small hands worked diligently, creating miniature vessels with varying levels of success. When Charlotte's boat immediately capsized, her face crumpled in disappointment. "Here, let's fix it together," Jackson offered, expecting tears. Instead, Charlotte nodded determinedly and watched carefully as he demonstrated again. Her second attempt stayed afloat, wobbling down the gentle current behind her sister's boats. The look of accomplishment on her face was worth more than any business deal Jackson had ever closed. As afternoon turned to evening, the triplets chased fireflies along the creek bank, their laughter, a sound still rare enough to make Jackson pause whenever he heard it, echoing across the water. Grace, typically so reserved, squealed with delight when she caught a firefly in her cupped hands, its gentle glow illuminating her small face. "Look, Jack, I caught a star," she called out, using his name directly for the first time. The simple moment, this quiet child voluntarily sharing her joy with him, felt monumental. As Jackson showed her how to release the firefly gently, their eyes met in a moment of shared wonder. On the walk back to the main house with twilight painting, the landscape in soft purples and blues, Charlotte slipped her tiny hand into Jackson's. The gesture, so casual from most children, represented a profound step in trust from this wounded little girl. Jackson Miller, who had built an empire through shrewd business deals and careful isolation, found himself humbled by the immensity of what these 3 small children had given him today. Their laughter, their trust, and the chance to remember joy. 5 months had passed since 3 tiny figures appeared on Jackson's dusty road. The transformation of the Miller Ranch was subtle, but profound. Rooms that had stood empty for years now held evidence of children. Colorful drawings adorned refrigerator doors, small boots lined the entryway, and toys occupied corners once pristine and sterile. The changes in the triplets were even more remarkable. They no longer slept on the floor, though they still shared a room by choice. Their faces had filled out, no longer bearing the pinched look of children accustomed to hunger. Most significantly, they had begun to develop individual interests, while maintaining their close bond. One crisp autumn morning, Jackson sat at his desk reviewing quarterly reports when a soft knock interrupted his concentration. "Come in," he called, expecting Walter or Elizabeth. Instead, Abigail stood in the doorway, her sisters flanking her as usual. "Mr. Jack," she began formally, "we want to draw. Can we sit here?" Jackson blinked in surprise. Not only was this the longest sentence Abigail had ever addressed to him, but Mr. Jack was a new development. A small but significant step from the cautious "sir" they had used before. "Of course," he replied, clearing a space at the corner of his large desk. The girls settled with their crayons and paper, working quietly while Jackson conducted a conference call with investors. He found himself watching them during the discussion. How Abigail drew bold, sweeping lines of mountains and sky. Charlotte created meticulous flowers in every color, and Grace sketched horses with surprising accuracy for a 3-year-old. When his secretary brought in coffee, Charlotte looked up and said clearly, "Thank you," without being prompted. The simple courtesy, so automatic in most children, represented months of healing for this formerly terrified little girl. That evening at dinner, another milestone occurred. As Walter served the roast chicken, Abigail held out her plate and said, "More, please." The table fell silent. It was the first time any of the triplets had asked for seconds without being urged that it was okay to want more food. "Of course," Walter replied smoothly, though Jackson caught the emotion in the older man's eyes. Walter had undergone his own transformation these past months. Initially apprehensive about children disrupting the ranch's order, he had become their devoted champion. The stern ranch manager now spent evenings teaching the girls to bake cookies and telling them stories about the ranch's history. When Rebecca Thompson visited for her monthly check-in, she marveled at the changes. "They're different children," she observed, watching the triplets helping Walter gather eggs, each with their own color-coded basket. Still cautious, still bonded unusually tightly, but they're beginning to thrive. They're remarkable, Jackson agreed, surprised by the pride that swelled in his chest. And how about you? Rebecca asked perceptively. How are you doing with all this? Jackson considered the question. 5 months ago, his life had been orderly, predictable, and empty. Now, it was chaotic, unpredictable, and full of challenges he'd never anticipated. His days no longer belonged entirely to him, and his house was no longer the pristine showcase it had once been. Before he could answer, Grace approached with a drawing, one of her meticulously detailed horses. She handed it to him without a word, her solemn eyes watching his reaction carefully. Thank you, Jackson said, genuinely touched. It's beautiful. Grace nodded once, the ghost of a smile flickering across her face before she returned to her sisters. I'm doing better than I have in years, Jackson told Rebecca, surprising himself with the truth of it. The winter months had brought a gentle peace to the Miller Ranch. As snow blanketed the Nebraska landscape, the main house had transformed into a true home. Jackson had adjusted his business schedule to accommodate morning horse feeding with the triplets and evening story times. The girls, now approaching their 4th birthday, had blossomed in this stable environment. One Tuesday morning, Jackson sat at the kitchen counter reviewing emails while the triplets ate breakfast. Walter entered with the day's mail, his expression unusually troubled. There's a letter from the Department of Social Services, he said quietly, handing Jackson an official-looking envelope. Something in Walter's tone made Jackson excuse himself to the study before opening it. Inside was a formal notification that made his blood run cold. This letter serves to inform you that Melissa Carter, biological mother of Abigail, Charlotte, and Grace Carter, has made contact with our department and expressed her intention to regain custody of her children. Jackson read the letter 3 times, his hands growing cold. The girl's mother, who had abandoned them with an elderly relative nearly a year ago, now wanted them back. A court date had been set for a preliminary hearing in 2 weeks. When Rebecca Thompson arrived that afternoon, her usual warm smile was replaced with professional concern. I wanted to discuss this in person, she explained as they sat in Jackson's office, far from little ears. Melissa Carter contacted our department last week. She claims she's been getting her life together and is now able to provide for the girls. After abandoning them for nearly a year? Jackson didn't bother hiding his anger. They didn't even have proper food or medical care when I found them. Rebecca nodded. I understand your frustration. The court will consider all factors, including the length of abandonment and the girl's current well-being. Do they have to see her before the hearing? Jackson asked, dreading the answer. There will be a supervised visitation to assess their relationship, Rebecca confirmed. We'll arrange it here at the ranch where they feel safe. The news gnawed at Jackson throughout the week. He found himself watching the triplets with a desperate intensity, memorizing moments he had previously taken for granted. Charlotte's delighted giggle when Ranger performed a trick, Abigail's serious expression as she helped Walter measure feed, Grace's rare but radiant smile when she mastered a new skill. He hadn't told them yet. How could he explain that the mother who had abandoned them now wanted them back, or that he who had promised to keep them safe might be powerless to prevent their removal? The day of Melissa Carter's visit arrived with a clear sky and bitter cold. Jackson paced the living room while Walter positioned himself protectively near the girls who were unaware of the coming storm. The sound of tires on gravel announced her arrival. Through the window, Jackson watched a woman step from a rented car, young, perhaps in her late 20s, dressed in clothes too fashionable for rural Nebraska. This was the woman who had left 3 toddlers with an elderly relative and disappeared. For 11 months, Rebecca arrived moments later to supervise the visit. Remember, she advised Jackson, remain calm regardless of what happens. The girls will take emotional cues from you. When Melissa Carter entered the living room, her eyes immediately filled with theatrical tears. My babies, she cried, rushing toward the triplets who were playing quietly with a puzzle. The girls looked up, clearly startled by this stranger's emotional display. Charlotte instinctively moved closer to Abigail, while Grace's expression shuddered completely. "Don't you recognize Mommy?" Melissa asked, crouching before them in her designer boots. Three identical faces regarded her with confusion and wariness. There was no recognition in their eyes, no joyful reunion. Just three small children shrinking back from a loud stranger. "It's me, Mommy," Melissa insisted, reaching for Charlotte, who immediately burst into tears and scrambled behind Jackson's legs. "Perhaps we should slow down," Rebecca suggested professionally. "It's been almost a year and they were very young when you left them." "Left them?" Melissa's voice took on a defensive edge. "I was looking for work. I always planned to come back." Throughout the difficult visit, Jackson observed Melissa carefully. Her attention frequently wandered from the children to the expensive furnishings of the ranch house. She took several photos, ostensibly of the girls, but Jackson noticed how the camera angle often captured more of the room than the children. When Abigail refused to sit on her lap, Melissa's facade of maternal devotion briefly cracked. "I'm your mother," she snapped. "You're supposed to love me." The visit concluded after an uncomfortable hour with little progress made. As Melissa prepared to leave, Jackson overheard her asking Rebecca about the financial arrangements and compensation for emotional distress. Something in her tone raised alarm bells. This wasn't about reconnecting with abandoned children. This was about something else entirely. That night, after finally calming the upset triplets and tucking them into bed, Jackson called his lawyer. "I need everything you can find on Melissa, Carter," he instructed. "Every detail, every connection, every motive." As he hung up, he heard a small noise at the door. Grace stood there in her pajamas, her observant eyes serious in her small face. "Are we going away?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson knelt to her level, his heart breaking at the fear in her eyes. "I'm doing everything I can to make sure you stay right here," he promised. Grace studied him with that penetrating gaze that always seemed to see straight through to the truth. Then, with unusual emotional directness, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his neck. "We want to stay with you," she whispered against his shoulder. In that moment, Jackson Miller, who had built his fortune through calculated risks and strategic planning, felt utterly powerless against the possibility of losing these three children who had somehow become the center of his world. The week following Melissa Carter's visit was tense at the Miller Ranch. Jackson maintained a cheerful facade for the triplets but spent his nights consulting with lawyers and investigators. Something about Melissa's behavior during the visit had triggered his business instincts, the same instincts that had helped him build his fortune by spotting opportunities and threats others missed. Rebecca Thompson arrived early Wednesday morning, her expression grim as she accepted the coffee Walter offered. "We've scheduled another supervised visit tomorrow," she informed Jackson. "Melissa has been quite persistent about accelerating the process. Have you noticed anything unusual about her interest?" Jackson asked carefully, keeping his voice low, as the girls played in the adjacent room with Elizabeth. Rebecca hesitated, professional caution warring with obvious concern. "I shouldn't speculate, but yes, there are aspects of her sudden reappearance that raise questions. She's been particularly interested in your financial status." Jackson nodded, unsurprised. "My investigators have been working around the clock. I'd like you to see what they've found." He spread several documents across the kitchen table. Melissa Carter had indeed been absent for 11 months, not seeking work as she claimed, but moving between luxury resorts with a succession of wealthy companions. Until 3 weeks ago, she had made no attempt to contact Martha or inquire about her daughters. "This is the most concerning development," Jackson said, pointing to a recent photograph. It showed Melissa with an older man, both dressed expensively. Martin Donovan, corporate attorney specializing in inheritance law and high-value settlements. Rebecca's eyes widened. "They're romantically involved?" "For about 6 weeks, according to my sources. Shortly after they met, she suddenly developed a burning interest in reclaiming her children." Jackson's voice hardened. "Children who are currently in the care of a single man worth approximately $40 million. You think this is about money?" Rebecca stated rather than asked. I believe an opportunity has been identified, Jackson replied carefully. The question is how to prove it. The doorbell rang, interrupting their conversation. Walter appeared. Moments later, his expression uncomfortable. Ms. Carter is here. She's demanding to see the children. Says she doesn't need an appointment to visit her own daughters. Jackson exchanged a glance with Rebecca, who nodded slightly. Let's see what happens. Melissa swept into the living room like a whirlwind of designer perfume and calculated emotion. This time she wasn't alone. A distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit followed closely. Martin Donovan himself. I couldn't wait until tomorrow, Melissa announced dramatically, eyes darting around the room until she spotted the triplets. My precious angels. The girls, who had been happily arranging toy horses with Elizabeth, immediately tensed. Charlotte edged behind the sofa, while Abigail stepped protectively in front of Grace. Ms. Carter, we had an agreement about supervised visits being scheduled in advance, Rebecca reminded her firmly. I have rights, Melissa countered, her voice rising. Tell them, Martin. The attorney cleared his throat. As the biological mother, Ms. Carter has certain inherent rights to access her children during this transitional period. While the adults argued legal points, Jackson noticed Martin Donovan subtly examining the room, noting features of the property, even taking out his phone to snap a few discreet photographs. The behavior confirmed Jackson's suspicions. Enough, he said quietly but with authority, moving to stand near the triplets. This unscheduled visit is clearly causing distress to the children. I must ask you to leave and respect the visitation schedule established by social services. Melissa's carefully maintained facade cracked. You can't keep them from me. Do you know how much a judge would award me if I sued for wrongful separation? Millions. The room fell silent. Rebecca's eyebrows shot up, while Martin Donovan placed a restraining hand on Melissa's arm too late. Melissa backtracked quickly. The emotional damage of being kept from their mother. The trauma. But the truth had been revealed. Jackson watched Martin Donovan's expression shift from confident to calculating as he assessed the damage his client had done to their strategy. From behind the sofa came a small voice. Charlotte, tears streaming down her face, emerged from hiding. You went away, she said, her voice trembling but clear. You left us with Auntie Martha and never came back. Sweetheart, Mommy had to... Melissa began, reaching for the child. Charlotte backed away. Jack doesn't leave. Jack gives us food and doesn't yell. Jack reads stories and helps when we're scared. The raw simplicity of the child's words hung in the room. Melissa's expression hardened, the mask of maternal concern slipping completely. This is ridiculous, she snapped. They're confused. He's obviously turned them against me. Abigail, always the protector, stepped forward. With a courage beyond her years, she looked directly at the woman who had abandoned them. You went away, she said firmly, echoing her sister's words. Jack is ours now. Martin Donovan, sensing a losing battle, tugged at Melissa's arm. We should continue this discussion through proper channels, he advised tightly. As Walter showed the unwelcome visitors out, Rebecca turned to Jackson, her professional demeanor momentarily forgotten. I'll be including every detail of this interaction in my report, she assured him. Particularly Ms. Carter's revealing comment about financial compensation. Jackson barely heard her. He was kneeling beside Charlotte, who had dissolved into tears after her brave stand. Grace and Abigail pressed close to their sister, offering silent support. You were very brave, he told Charlotte gently. All of you were. Through her tears, Charlotte looked up at him with absolute trust. A look that cemented Jackson's determination. These children would not be used as pawns in a financial scheme. Whatever it took, whatever resources needed to be deployed, he would protect them. The county courthouse stood imposingly against the winter sky, its red brick facade and white columns a stark contrast to the gray December morning. Jackson adjusted his tie nervously as he helped the triplets from his SUV. Despite his wealth and business acumen, he had never felt more vulnerable than today, when a judge would determine whether these three little girls would remain in his care. Remember what we practiced, Walter said gently, kneeling to the triplets' level. Answer the nice judge's questions as best you can. The girls nodded solemnly, dressed in matching blue dresses with white cardigans, outfits they had chosen themselves for this important day. Charlotte clutched her stuffed horse tightly, a comfort object Jackson had suggested might help with her anxiety. Inside, the courtroom was already filling with familiar faces. Martha sat in the front row, her health much improved, but her expression worried. Rebecca Thompson conferred quietly with Jackson's attorney. Elizabeth Jenkins, the retired teacher who had become indispensable to their household, sat with several ranch hands who had taken the day off to show support. Even Dr. Miller, the local veterinarian who had befriended the triplets during his visits to the ranch, had come to stand as a character witness. The community's response had been overwhelming. These three little girls had touched many lives during their time at the Miller Ranch. Jackson was directing the triplets to their seats when Melissa Carter entered with Martin Donovan and another attorney. She was impeccably dressed in a conservative outfit that seemed calculated to project maternal responsibility. When she spotted the girls, she rushed forward with arms outstretched, only to be intercepted by Rebecca. Please respect the court's guidelines regarding interaction before the hearing, Rebecca reminded her firmly. Melissa's saccharine smile faltered. I just want to hug my babies. From their seats beside Jackson, the triplets watched this exchange with wary eyes. Abigail's small hand found Jackson's and held on tight. Judge Eleanor Simmons entered, a formidable woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and piercing eyes. As the proceedings began, Jackson tried to focus on his attorney's opening statements rather than the knot of fear in his stomach. How could he possibly convey to this court what these children meant to him? How in less than a year, they had transformed from traumatized strangers to the heart of his world. Melissa's attorney presented first, weaving a sympathetic narrative about a struggling young mother who had made a regrettable but temporary arrangement while seeking work. He described her remarkable personal growth and presented a detailed parenting plan. Throughout his presentation, Melissa dabbed at convincing tears, her eyes frequently seeking the judges for maximum emotional impact. When Jackson's attorney presented their case, he methodically outlined the 11 months of complete abandonment, the desperate conditions in which the girls were found, and their remarkable progress at the Miller Ranch. Medical records from their first hospital visit showed significant malnourishment. Photos from their early days at the ranch documented their fear and withdrawal, contrasted with recent images of 3 thriving children. Martha testified about Melissa's increasingly infrequent visits before disappearing entirely, and her refusal to answer desperate phone calls when money for food and medicine ran out. She told me it was temporary, Martha said, her voice steady despite her evident emotion. Just 2 weeks while she found work in Omaha. Then 2 weeks became a month, became 6 months. The last time I called her when I was too sick to get out of bed, she said she'd send money. She never did. The most compelling testimony came from Rebecca Thompson, who described her professional observations of the triplets' attachment to Jackson and their lack of recognition of their biological mother. In my professional opinion, she concluded, removing these children from their current stable environment would be traumatic and detrimental to their emotional development. Judge Simmons then requested to speak with the triplets privately in her chambers. As they followed the court officer, 3 small figures in blue dresses, Jackson felt as though his heart were walking out of the room. The 30 minutes that followed were the longest of Jackson's life. When the judge returned with the girls, her expression was unreadable, but Jackson noticed Charlotte seemed more relaxed, even smiling slightly as she returned to her seat. Judge Simmons adjusted her glasses and surveyed the courtroom before speaking. Family law presents us with complex situations where there are rarely perfect solutions, she began. We must always prioritize the best interests of the children above all other considerations. She turned her attention to Melissa. Ms. Carter, while biology creates a parental relationship, it is actions that define parenting. Your decision, to leave your daughters for 11 months without adequate provision for their care, constitutes abandonment under state law. The judge then addressed Jackson. Mr. Miller, you took in 3 traumatized children with no legal obligation to do so. You've provided not just material necessities but emotional stability and individual attention to their needs. Judge Simmons paused, removing her glasses. Before announcing my decision, I want to share something that Grace said to me in chambers. When asked where she felt safest, this child who rarely speaks said, and I quote, "Jack makes the monsters go away and fixes our food without yelling." The simple statement hung in the air, profound in its childlike clarity. It is the finding of this court that permanent guardianship be granted to Jackson Miller, with a path to formal adoption to begin immediately. The gavel struck with finality. This court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted in muted congratulations. Martha wept openly while Walter clasped Jackson's shoulder. Even Rebecca Thompson allowed her professional demeanor to slip as she smiled broadly at the outcome. Amid the celebration, Jackson knelt to embrace the triplets, who seemed both confused and relieved by the adults' reactions. "Does this mean we stay with you forever?" Abigail asked, her small face serious. "Yes," Jackson answered, his voice thick with emotion. "If that's what you want." Grace, who had been silent throughout the proceedings, reached up to touch his cheek, where tears had begun to fall. "Home," she said simply, the single word containing a universe of meaning. The Miller Ranch transformed as December progressed, shedding its usual practical appearance for one of festive warmth. For the first time since Sarah's death, Jackson had authorized a full holiday decoration of the main house. Twinkling lights outlined the sprawling porch, and a majestic 12-foot pine tree dominated the great room, visible through the picture windows as one approached the property. "Higher, Walter," Charlotte directed excitedly as the ranch manager carefully placed a handmade ornament on an upper branch. "It needs to catch the light." The ornaments, clay impressions of the girls' tiny handprints, each painted in their favorite colors, had been Elizabeth's project with them. Alongside store-bought decorations hung these precious tokens and paper snowflakes carefully cut by small, determined hands. Jackson watched from the doorway, a mug of hot chocolate warming his hands. 5 years of Christmas had passed in a blur of business meetings and solitary dinners since losing Sarah. He had forgotten the magic that children brought to the season, the wide-eyed wonder at simple things like twinkling lights, and the anticipation that made each December day special. "Jack, come see," Abigail called, waving him over to inspect their work. The formal Mr. Jack had given way to the simpler, more familiar Jack in recent weeks, another small but significant step in their evolving relationship. The evening of Christmas Eve brought a gathering unlike any the ranch had seen in years. Martha arrived with her sister from Omaha. Rebecca Thompson stopped by with cookies and gifts. Ranch hands and their families filled the usually quiet rooms with laughter and conversation. Even Dr. Miller came bearing a surprise, 3 matching cowgirl hats for the triplets who wore them proudly throughout the evening. As the guests settled in the great room after dinner, Martha presented an unexpected gift, a carefully preserved photo album. "I saved these," she explained as the triplets gathered around. "I thought they should have something from their early days." The album contained precious photographs of the girls as infants and toddlers, images from before Jackson knew them. He watched their reactions carefully, uncertain how this connection to their past might affect them. "We were so tiny," Charlotte marveled, pointing at a photo of 3 identical newborns bundled in hospital blankets. "That was our first day," Martha explained gently. "You were born early but strong." Each page filled a blank space in the triplets' history, providing them with something every child deserves, a sense of their own beginnings. Jackson observed how they absorbed these images with curiosity rather than distress, secure enough now to explore their past without fear. As the evening drew to a close, the gathering moved to the dining room for Christmas Eve dinner. Walter had outdone himself, preparing a feast that honored both tradition and the girls' developing tastes. Before they began, Jackson proposed a simple toast. "In our family," he explained, "we always share something we're grateful for before the Christmas meal." The tradition was one he'd abandoned after Sarah's death, finding nothing worth expressing gratitude for in those dark years. Now, surrounded by the community that had formed around three little girls who needed them, he found himself overwhelmed with things to be thankful for. The guests shared their thoughts, from Martha's gratitude for restored health to Walter's appreciation for laughter in the house again. When it came to Abigail's turn, she stood on her chair, her expression solemn. "We are grateful for Daddy Jack and for Ranger," she announced clearly. Her declaration met with a moment of stunned silence before gentle applause filled the room. It was the first time any of the triplets had called him Daddy. Spring arrived at the Miller Ranch, bringing with it new life. The pastures turned emerald green, wildflowers dotted the meadows, and the triplets spent joyful hours exploring the outdoors with Ranger bounding alongside them. The formal adoption process was underway, with paperwork moving steadily through the system. Jackson sat on the porch one April morning reviewing contracts while the girls helped Walter plant a vegetable garden nearby. Their growth in the past 10 months had been remarkable, not just physically but emotionally. The wary, traumatized children who once slept huddled on the floor had blossomed into confident, curious 4-year-olds who now called him Daddy. Jack, without hesitation. The mail delivery interrupted his thoughts. Sorting through the envelopes, Jackson froze when he recognized the handwriting on a pale blue envelope. Melissa Carter's looping script was unmistakable. Inside was a 5-page letter filled with declarations of remorse and claims of personal transformation. Melissa described therapy sessions and parenting classes, insisting she had truly changed and deserved another chance. The letter included several old photographs of the triplets as babies and promises of making up for lost time. But it was the final paragraph that revealed her true purpose. A request to reconsider allowing visitation rights, with a thinly veiled suggestion that such generosity might benefit everyone financially. Jackson slipped the letter into his pocket, his mind troubled. Though the courts had granted him permanent guardianship, he sometimes wondered what the right moral choice was regarding the girl's biological mother. Did they deserve to know her despite her abandonment? Would contact bring healing or new trauma? That afternoon, he took the triplets to their favorite spot by the lake. As they watched ducks glide across the water, Jackson carefully broached the subject. "I received a letter today," he began, "from your birth mother." 3 identical faces turned to him with varying expressions. Abigail's guardedness, Charlotte's immediate anxiety, and Grace's quiet assessment. "She sent some pictures of when you were babies," he continued, showing them the photographs. "And she's asking if she could visit you sometimes." Jackson had expected fear or confusion. Instead, each girl responded with a surprising clarity that reminded him how much they had grown. Abigail examined the photos with detached curiosity, as if studying strangers. "We don't look like that anymore," she observed simply. Charlotte handed the letter back without reading it. "No, thank you," she said firmly, a complete sentence that would have been unthinkable months ago. It was Grace, ever the observer, who surprised him most. She took the letter, studied it briefly, then looked up at Jackson with her penetrating gaze. "Home is here," she stated with quiet certainty. Then, with the uncomplicated logic of childhood, she began folding the letter into a paper boat, a skill Jackson had taught them months ago. When she finished, she looked to him for permission. Jackson nodded, understanding her intention perfectly. Grace leaned forward and gently set the paper boat on the water. They watched in silence as Melissa's promises and demands drifted away across the lake, carried by the spring breeze until they disappeared from sight. Jackson put his arm around the 3 small bodies beside him, feeling a sense of closure wash over them all. Sometimes the most profound wisdom came from the youngest hearts, those who could recognize their true home with perfect clarity. The summer sun cast golden light across the Miller Ranch, transforming the vast property into a portrait of idyllic country life. 6-year-old triplets raced across the meadow, their matching cowgirl boots, one blue, one purple, one pink, kicking up dust as they chased after Ranger, now a mature border collie but still playful as ever. Girls, lunch in 15 minutes. Jackson called from the porch of what was now truly a family home. 3 years had passed since the courthouse decision that made them officially Millers. The formal adoption had been finalized on the triplets' 5th birthday, a day marked with a celebration that brought the entire community together. The ranch itself had evolved alongside its youngest residents, balancing its commercial success with a newfound purpose. The east section of the property now housed the Miller Foundation for Children, a nonprofit organization offering rural therapy, experiences for orphaned and traumatized children. The triplets, still inseparable but increasingly independent, had become unofficial ambassadors for the program. Each had grown into her unique personality while maintaining their special bond. Abigail, the natural leader, now helped Walter with the ranch's accounting books, her mathematical talent emerging early as she tracked feed quantities and animal inventories with surprising accuracy. Charlotte, once the most fearful, had developed an almost mystical connection with horses, earning the nickname the Little Horse Whisperer from the ranch hands. And Grace, whose silence had once worried Jackson, now captivated visitors with elaborate stories she created for the children who came to experience the healing power of rural life. Jackson watched from the porch as his daughters, for that's truly what they were now, raced toward the house for lunch. At 48, the lines around his eyes had softened from laughter rather than hardened from isolation. The business empire still thrived, but it had become a means rather than an end, a resource to secure his family's future and help other children find their way home. That evening, as he tucked the girls into their beds, individual rooms now, though they still occasionally migrated to one another during storms, Jackson paused in Grace's doorway. Unlike her sisters who had quickly fallen asleep, she sat up with her sketchbook, working intently by lamplight. "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" he asked, sitting beside her. Grace held up the page, revealing a colorful scene of 5 figures, Jackson, the 3 girls, and Ranger, standing hand in hand beneath a radiant sun. Above them, in careful block letters, she had written the word home. "It's us," she explained simply, her voice no longer the whisper it had been when they first met. "I'm showing it to the new kids tomorrow, so they know they can find a home too." Jackson felt his heart expand with a love so profound, it was almost overwhelming. These 3 little girls, once abandoned on a dusty road, had not only found healing but had become healers themselves. As Grace yawned and finally settled under her covers, Jackson leaned down to kiss her forehead. "Good night, my brave girl." "Night, Daddy," she murmured, her eyes already closing. In the quiet hallway, Jackson paused to absorb the peaceful sounds of his home. 3 gentle breaths from 3 bedrooms, Ranger's contented sigh from his spot in the hallway, the distant whisper of Nebraska wind across the land that had been in his family for generations. A family that now continued not through blood, but through the far stronger bonds of love, courage, and the choice to belong to one another. Sometimes, he reflected, our greatest blessings arrive in the most unexpected packages, or in his case, as 3 small figures on a dusty road, leading him home when he didn't even know he was lost.